The soup was still warm when Etta Boone pressed her back against the jailhouse wall and heard the marshal say he was going to hang Clement Winslow at dawn. She held the tin bowl with both hands, her knuckles white against the dented metal, the steam rising in thin ribbons through the cold October air of Harlow Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the year 1882. The broth inside smelled of sage and bone, and the dried chili peppers she had crushed between her palms that morning, not knowing then that she would be standing here now, on the wrong side of the law, on the wrong side of everything she had been raised to believe. With her heart hammering so hard against her ribs, she was certain the deputy posted at the front door could hear it. "Winslow doesn't get visitors," Marshal Tate had told her when she first walked up to the jailhouse door with the soup. His voice had the practiced flatness of a man who had said those exact words 100 times to 100 different people. "He doesn't get mail. He doesn't get prayers from the reverend. He doesn't get a last meal until the morning of." "He's sick," Etta had said, because that was the truth, and she had always been a woman who led with the truth even when it put her in danger. "I heard him coughing from the street. A man who dies of fever before you can hang him is a man who cheats your justice." That had given the marshal pause. Marshal Tate was nothing if not a man who cared deeply about the proper administration of justice. He had let her in. And now Etta stood just outside the iron-barred cell in the back of the jailhouse, and she could see Clement Winslow through the bars, and the sight of him undid something inside her that she had spent the better part of 6 weeks carefully constructing. He was not what she had expected. She had expected a monster. The posters described one: Clement Winslow, wanted dead or alive, armed and extremely dangerous, suspected in the robbery of the Santa Fe Railroad and the killing of 3 men in Dona County, New Mexico Territory, and 2 men in Cochise County, Arizona Territory. The reward was $500. In 1882, that was a fortune. In 1882, that kind of money could buy a life or end one. What she saw through the bars was a man lying on a cot with his arm thrown over his eyes, breathing in the shallow, careful way of someone whose lungs were causing him grief. He had dark hair that had grown past his collar, a jaw rough with several days of beard, and hands that were large and still and folded now over his chest as if he were already rehearsing for the coffin. He was not much older than her, she thought. 28, maybe 30. She was 25. The coughing came then, as if her presence had summoned it, a deep and ragged sound that shook his whole chest and made him curl sideways on the cot in a way that looked involuntary and therefore real. Etta moved before she thought about it. She stepped forward and crouched at the base of the cell bars and pushed the bowl of soup through the gap at the bottom where the stone floor had worn unevenly over years of boots and time. "Drink that," she said. "All of it. The sage will help the congestion, and the marrow will put something back in you." Clement Winslow lowered his arm from his eyes and looked at her. His eyes were gray. Not the dull gray of overcast sky, but the sharp, living gray of creek water moving over slate. They looked at her with an expression she could not immediately name, which was itself notable, because Etta had always been good at reading expressions. She had learned to be. When your father drank and your mother prayed and the space between them was a battlefield you had to navigate every day of your childhood, you learned to read the weather of a human face the way a farmer learned to read actual weather. What she saw in Clement Winslow's face was not gratitude, exactly, and it was not suspicion, exactly. It was the look of a man encountering something he had genuinely stopped believing in. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was rough from the cough and from something else, something older. "Etta Boone," she said. "I run the boarding house on Sycamore Street, the one with the blue shutters." "Why," he said, and paused to manage another cough, quieter this time, "would you bring soup to a man you don't know?" Etta looked at him for a long moment. Outside, she could hear Marshal Tate moving around in the front office, the creak of his chair, the clink of his spurs. She had maybe 5 minutes before he told her time was up. "Because I know what it feels like," she said, "to be sick and alone and to have nobody bring you anything." It was the most honest thing she had ever said to a stranger, and it dropped into the silence between them like a stone into still water, and the ripples of it would not stop moving for a very long time. She did not know, in that moment, that the dark past behind those gray eyes was more complicated than any wanted poster could contain. She did not know that the betrayal at the center of his story was not what the law said it was. She did not know that within 48 hours she would be forced into a choice between the life she had built in Harlow Creek and the life she had always, secretly, wanted. She did not know that Clement Winslow was not the man the posters said he was, and she did not know that the man the posters said he was would be coming to Harlow Creek before the week was out. She only knew that he was sick, and she had made soup, and something about the look in his gray eyes made her feel, for the first time in years, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. This is where it began. Though to understand how it ended, you had to go back further than that jailhouse, further than the soup, all the way back to the week before, when a half-drowned stranger had come stumbling up the back steps of the Blue Shutter boarding house on a Tuesday night with rain in his hair and a bullet crease along his left shoulder, and Etta Boone had opened the door. She had been living in Harlow Creek for 3 years by the autumn of 1882. She had come from Amarillo, Texas, after her father died and left behind nothing but debts and a house the creditors took before the body was cold. Her mother had gone to live with her sister in Albuquerque. Etta had looked at the stage route options spread before her like a hand of cards and chosen Harlow Creek because she had heard there was a boarding house for sale, and she had enough money saved from 2 years of working in a dry goods store to make a reasonable offer. The boarding house had been everything she had hoped and everything she had feared. It was work that started before sunrise and ended after midnight. It was mending curtains and killing mice and hauling water and cooking for 6 boarders who ranged from grateful to contemptible. It was loneliness of a very specific variety, the loneliness of being surrounded by people and still having nobody who truly saw you. But it was hers. The blue shutters were hers. The kitchen with the big cast-iron stove was hers. The garden out back where she grew the sage and the peppers and the tomatoes was hers, and that mattered more than she could say. She had been in that garden on the Tuesday night in question, covering the last of the pepper plants against what looked like an early frost, when she heard the sound. Not dramatic, not the kind of thing that announces itself with urgency. Just a low, unsteady sound, like a man who has been holding himself together through will alone and has just run out of will. She turned, and there he was at the garden gate, one hand gripping the post, the rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead, his shirt dark on the left shoulder in a way that was not entirely from the rain. Etta was not a woman given to panic. She assessed the situation in the space of 2 seconds. Man, injured, alone, rain, night. She made her decision in the space of 1 second more, which was that she was going to help him because that was the kind of woman she was, regardless of the complications it might bring. "Can you walk?" she asked. "I've been walking for 4 miles," he said. "I can walk a little further." She brought him inside through the back door, into the kitchen, and sat him at the table and lit the lamp and looked at his shoulder. The wound was a graze, serious but not fatal, the kind that was more impressive looking than it was dangerous if you cleaned it properly and kept the fever down. She had seen worse. She had treated worse, on her father, on boarders who got themselves into trouble in the saloon. She had a steady hand and an unsentimental approach to blood, which she had always considered one of her more practical qualities. She cleaned the wound with whiskey and bound it with strips of clean muslin, and he sat through the whole thing without making a sound beyond one sharp intake of breath at the whiskey, which she appreciated. Men who made a lot of noise about pain were, in her experience, men who expected you to feel sorry for them rather than help them. "Who are you?" she asked when she had tied off the bandage. "Nobody important," he said. "That's not true," she said, "or you wouldn't have a bullet crease." Something moved in his eyes. Almost amusement, not quite. "Clement Winslow," he said. The name meant nothing to her then. She had not yet seen the wanted poster. The poster had not yet arrived in Harlow Creek, which was a small enough town that it was sometimes the last to receive official communications from the territorial marshals. "Etta Boone," she said, "this is my boarding house. You're welcome to a room for the night if you have the money, and if you can give me your word you won't bring trouble through my front door." He looked at her then with that expression she would come to know, the one that held something complicated and unresolved behind the gray. "I can give you my word," he said. "Whether trouble follows it is another matter. It usually does." She studied him for a moment. "That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in a year," she said. "Go ahead and take the room. End of the hall upstairs. 2 bits a night, breakfast included." He nodded, and she showed him to the room, and that was that, or that was what she thought. She did not sleep well that night. She told herself it was because she was listening for sounds of trouble. She did not examine the other reason closely. He was gone when she came downstairs in the morning. The room was neat, the bed made as well as a man could make a bed, which was to say imperfectly but with evident effort. On the small table beside the bed he had left a silver dollar, which was more than the agreed price. She stood in the doorway of that room for a moment, looking at the silver dollar, and felt something she could not name, which was unusual enough that it stayed with her through the whole of that day and the next. The wanted poster arrived on Thursday, tacked to the post outside the sheriff's office, and Etta saw it on her way to the dry goods store for flour and coffee. She stopped and read it twice, and then stood very still for a moment in the middle of the sidewalk while 2 ranchers stepped around her with mild annoyance. The name, Clement Winslow. The face in the rough woodcut illustration on the poster was blunt-featured and shadowed, the way all wanted poster faces were, but something in the set of it recalled the man at her kitchen table, his dark hair, the angle of his jaw. 3 men killed in Dona County, 2 men killed in Cochise County. The Santa Fe Railroad robbery, $500. She went home and stood in her kitchen for a long time. She did not go to the sheriff that day. She told herself it was because she had no proof it was the same man, that a name and a resemblance were not certainty. She told herself that if she had truly harbored a wanted criminal she would have a legal obligation, yes, but she had not known, and the man was gone, and there was nothing to report. She did not examine too closely the fact that she also simply did not want to report him. That was the part that troubled her when she let herself think about it, which she tried not to. He came back on Saturday. She was on the porch of the boarding house in the early morning, shelling dried beans into a bowl, when she looked up and he was standing at the gate again, this time in the clear autumn light, his shoulder apparently troubling him less, his face no longer rain-washed and desperate but careful and deliberate, as if he had made a decision and was standing before her as a result of it. "I should have told you who I was," he said, "when you took me in." Etta looked at him. She did not put down the beans. "I know who you are now," she said. He absorbed that with a small nod. "Then you know you should send me away." "I know what the law says I should do," she said, which was not quite the same thing, and both of them understood it. He came up the porch steps and sat in the other chair, the one that was usually empty, and she went on shelling the beans, and for a while neither of them said anything. A rooster was making noise somewhere down the street. The sky was the particular deep blue that it got in the high desert of New Mexico territory in early October, the kind of blue that seemed to promise something. "Tell me the truth," she said finally, "about the killings." He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she thought he might refuse. Then he said, "The 2 men in Cochise County were self-defense. They came at me with drawn guns and I was faster. There were witnesses who would have said so, but the men I shot were connected to a man named Roland Driscoll, who owns most of Cochise County and 2 of the judges in it, so the witnesses kept quiet and I was named a murderer. And the 3 in Dona County. I wasn't there," he said. "The robbery on the railroad, I was there. I'm not going to lie to you about that. I needed money and I made a bad decision and I was there. But I didn't kill anyone during it. The men who died in Dona County, died a week later in a separate incident that I had nothing to do with. My name got attached to it because I was already wanted and because it was convenient. Etta sat with that. She was a woman who had grown up hearing her father explain away every drinking debt, every broken promise, every missed rent payment, and she had learned to hear the specific music of a man constructing a false version of events. What she heard from Clement Winslow had a different sound. It had the flat, uncomfortable quality of a true thing being said without ornamentation, because the man saying it had decided that ornamentation was a luxury he could no longer afford. "Why did you come back?" she asked. "Because I've been running for 2 years," he said, "and I'm tired. Because you gave me a bed and a bandage and didn't ask me to be anything I'm not, and that is a rarer thing than I can tell you." He looked at her when he said it, and she looked back at him, and the moment sat between them with a weight that felt significant. "You can stay," she said, "in the room, but not indefinitely. I run a legitimate business and I have other boarders and I can't." "I understand," he said. "A few days. I need to rest the shoulder and then I'll move on." "Where will you go?" He was quiet again. "I don't know," he admitted, and it cost him something to say it. She could see that. A man like him, a man who had been surviving on cleverness and speed and the ability to always have a plan, admitting that he had no plan was not a small thing. "Then rest first," she said, "and plan second." She stood up and took the bean bowl inside. "Breakfast in an hour." He ate breakfast with the other boarders. A retired surveyor named Mr. Aldous Pitts, who was hard of hearing and deeply interested in geology, and a young telegraph operator named Cal Finney, who was 22 and talked too much and asked no dangerous questions because he was almost exclusively interested in discussing baseball. Clement Winslow sat at the table and ate Etta's biscuits and her fried salt pork and her scrambled eggs, and drank 2 cups of coffee, and answered to the name of Clement and offered no last name, and nobody pressed him for one. That was a characteristic of Harlow Creek that Etta had come to appreciate. It was a town at a crossroads, literally and figuratively. The road from El Paso ran through it heading north toward Santa Fe. The road from Tucson ran through it heading east toward the Texas border. People came through Harlow Creek who were going somewhere else, and people came through who were coming from somewhere they didn't discuss, and the town had developed a polite civic habit of not asking questions that weren't its business. Still, the wanted poster was on the post outside the sheriff's office, and Sheriff Caleb Morrow was not a man who would overlook what was sitting under his nose if someone pointed his nose at it. The someone was a man named Price, Frank Price, who arrived in Harlow Creek on a Monday morning with a deputy's badge from Cochise County that may or may not have been legitimate, and an air of professional menace that was absolutely legitimate. He went directly from the stage to the sheriff's office, and by Monday afternoon, he was showing the wanted poster around the saloon and the dry goods store and asking about strangers. Etta found out about Frank Price from Cal Finney, who found out about everything eventually, because he spent a great deal of time in the saloon and had one of those faces that made people forget he was listening. "There's a bounty hunter," Cal said at supper that Monday, helping himself to a third biscuit with the enthusiasm of a man who has never had to cook for himself. "Looking for somebody. $500. Mr. Pitts, who had caught enough of this through his selective hearing, looked up from his chicken and said, 500. Someone important." Etta kept her face very still and passed the gravy. Upstairs, in the room at the end of the hall, Clement Winslow was sleeping, his shoulder healing, the cough that had been troubling him since the rainy night starting to settle into his chest in a way that would become a real problem within another day. After supper, after the dishes, she went upstairs and knocked on his door, and he answered it looking worse than he had that morning, his face flushed with what was clearly the beginning of a real fever. "There's a man named Frank Price in town," she said. "He has your poster." The fever flush was supplanted briefly by something sharper. "Price," he said, and the way he said it told her there was a history there. "How much time do I have?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. He's been at the saloon. He may go door to door tomorrow. She paused. You can't travel, not in this state. He looked at her, and she could see him thinking, calculating, running through options with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 2 years doing nothing but calculating odds and exits. If he finds me here, you'll be implicated, he said. I know that. Why aren't you telling him yourself? The reward is $500. That's a great deal of money. I know that too, she said. He looked at her for a long time. The fever was making his eyes too bright, which made the gray of them more intense, which was a detail she noticed and filed away in the part of herself she was trying not to examine too closely. You're either the most trusting woman I've ever met, he said, or the most dangerous. Neither, she said. I just don't believe the whole story yet. And I don't send men to hang on a partial story. That was when she heard footsteps on the stairs and her heart seized, but it was only Cal Finney going to bed, and she let out a quiet breath and looked at Clement Winslow and said, Rest, I'll think of something. She did not think of something that night. What happened instead was that Clement Winslow's fever broke the wrong way, going higher instead of lower, and she spent most of Tuesday night sitting beside his bed with a damp cloth and a bowl of cool water, pressing the cloth to his forehead and listening to his breathing, and talking to him when the fever made him restless and confused, not because she thought he could hear her, but because the silence was too loud. She talked about Amarillo, about her father, the specific grief of loving someone who made himself impossible to love consistently, about the morning she arrived in Harlow Creek on the stage and saw the boarding house for the first time with its faded shutters that she would eventually paint blue, about what it meant to her to have a place that was hers, entirely hers, something that could not be taken or drunk away or lost to someone else's failures. She did not know until much later that he heard all of it. Frank Price knocked on the door of the Blue Shutter boarding house on Wednesday morning while Clement was still in his room, still feverish, still in no condition to run. Etta answered the door in her apron, her hair pinned up, with flour on her hands from the morning's bread, which was both true and also calculated to project an image of industrious domesticity that she hoped would read as unconcerning. Frank Price was a thick-necked man of about 40 with pale eyes and the broad, flat affect of someone who had made a career of suppressing anything that might read as ordinary human feeling because feeling made you slower. He had a badge pinned to his coat and a photograph, not the woodcut poster, an actual photograph which was more current and therefore more concerning. He held it up. You seen this man? Etta looked at the photograph. She looked at it with the particular kind of careful attention that she applied to things she was hoping she could walk away from without lying. Handsome man, she said. Price's pale eyes did not change. I'll take that as a no. I get travelers through here, she said. Dozens a week. I don't always remember faces. You'd remember this one, Price said. He's got a bullet crease on his left shoulder. Recent. Might still be favoring it. Nobody like that has stayed here, she said, which was technically true in the sense that anyone favoring a shoulder wound would not, she hoped, be visibly favoring it at this moment. Price looked at her for a moment with those flat, pale eyes. Then he touched his hat brim, which was not courtesy so much as the formal acknowledgement that the conversation was paused rather than concluded, and walked away. Etta closed the door and stood in the hallway with her back against the wood and her hands still floury and her heart going hard enough to make her slightly unsteady. Upstairs, she heard coughing, the deep, ragged kind that meant the fever had found its way into his chest. She went to the kitchen and made soup. That was when things moved quickly toward the outcome she had not predicted, and the marshal had. Frank Price went from the boarding house to the saloon to the sheriff's office, and somewhere along that route he crossed paths with a rancher who had been at the dry goods store on Saturday morning and had seen, through the store window, a dark-haired man matching the wanted poster's description going up the steps of the Blue Shutter boarding house. Sheriff Morrow came himself, not Price. He came in the late afternoon on Wednesday with 2 deputies and a warrant and the apologetic courtesy of a man who respected Etta and genuinely regretted the necessity. "Etta," he said, standing on her porch with his hat in his hands, "I need to come in." She stepped back and let him in. They found Clement in the room at the end of the hall, which she had not barred because barring it would have implied she had something to hide, and she had decided that her best chance, his best chance, lay in something other than concealment. She did not know exactly what it lay in, but she had spent the afternoon thinking about it, and she had a direction. He was sitting on the edge of the bed when they opened the door, dressed, upright, clearly having heard them coming, and made himself as presentable as a man with a chest fever could manage. He did not reach for anything. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the sheriff with those gray eyes that were too bright with fever but steady. "Clement Winslow," the sheriff said. "Yes," he said. "They took him to the jailhouse. They took him gently, which Etta appreciated, in the sense that neither of the deputies manhandled him, and the sheriff himself took his arm on the stairs in a way that acknowledged the fever rather than ignoring it. They took him as if they understood they were arresting a sick man, which did not make the arrest right but made it somewhat less brutal. Etta watched from the doorway of the boarding house. Clement Winslow, being walked down Sycamore Street toward the jailhouse, turned his head and looked back at her over his shoulder, and the look on his face was something she would carry with her for a long time. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was something that lived in the same territory as gratitude and regret, and the specific expression of a man who has been surprised by kindness and is not quite sure what to do with it. She went inside. She made soup. And the next morning she was standing outside the jail cell with the bowl pressed between her hands, the steam rising through the cold air, listening to Marshal Tate tell his deputy that the circuit judge would arrive by Thursday and the hanging would be scheduled for Friday at dawn. "Marshal Tate," she said, because she had thought about this all the way from the boarding house to the jailhouse, and she had arrived at something. "I need to speak to you privately." He frowned. "This isn't a social visit, Etta." "It isn't," she agreed. "It's a legal one. I have information relevant to the Winslow case, and I believe you are obligated to hear it." That gave him pause again. Marshal Tate was, above all things, a man who understood obligation. He took her into his office and closed the door, and she sat across the desk from him and told him what she knew, not everything. She was not foolish, but the piece of it that she thought mattered most. "I've been corresponding," she said, "with a woman named Mrs. Clara Hensley in Bisbee, Arizona Territory, since she wrote to me last spring looking for her husband's boarding records here in New Mexico. Her husband was one of the men killed in Dona County. She told me in her letters that she believes the man who killed her husband was someone named Wade Calder, not Clement Winslow. She says her husband owed Calder money and told her before he died that if anything happened to him it would be Calder's doing." This was not quite accurate. The correspondence with Clara Hensley was real, but it had been about something more mundane, and it was only in the last 2 days, the days since Clement was arrested, that Etta had thought to reach out by telegraph with specific questions, and Clara's response, received that morning via Cal Finney at the telegraph office, had given her something to work with. Marshal Tate was quiet for a long time. "That's hearsay," he said finally. "A widow's suspicion." "It's a lead," Etta said, "that you are legally and morally obligated to pursue before you hang a man who may not have committed the crime you're hanging him for." He looked at her. She looked back at him. She was wearing her best dress and her expression of absolute conviction, both of which she had put on deliberately that morning. "You have a powerful lot of interest in a man you barely know," Tate said. "I have a powerful lot of interest in justice being done correctly," she said, "which I believe you share." He sent a telegram to the marshal's office in Dona County that afternoon. He did not cancel the circuit judge's arrival or the hearing, but he sent the telegram, and that was the thing that mattered. Meanwhile, Etta went back to the jail with the soup, which Marshal Tate allowed on the grounds that a dying prisoner was in nobody's interest. The deputy, A young man named Harker, who was sympathetic in the vague way of young men who had not yet fully decided what kind of people they were going to be, unlocked the cell block and let her stand at the bars. Clement Winslow was sitting up when she came in this time. The fever was not gone, but it had receded to something more manageable, and he looked at her with the full clarity of a man who was paying attention. She pushed the soup under the bars. "You talked to Tate," he said. "It was not a question." "I told him about Clara Hensley," she said. He was still for a moment. "How do you know about Clara Hensley?" "I didn't until 2 days ago," she said. "I asked the right questions." He picked up the soup bowl and held it in both hands, and she thought from his expression that the warmth of it was almost as welcome as the content. "Wade Calder," he said quietly. "You know that name?" "I do now." "Calder is the reason I'm on those posters," he said, his voice low and careful, watching her face. "He's Roland Driscoll's man. I was working for the Santa Fe Railroad Survey crew 2 years ago. I found something I wasn't supposed to find. Evidence that Driscoll had been defrauding the railroad's land grants, moving boundary stakes, claiming water rights that weren't his. I was going to take it to the railroad's attorneys. Before I could, 2 of Driscoll's men came to my tent at night." He stopped, managed the next words with flat precision. "I killed them, in self-defense. Driscoll had Calder attach my name to the Dona Ana murders to make sure no one would listen to anything I said. A wanted murderer doesn't get to testify." Etta looked at him for a long time. The soup was cooling in his hands. The afternoon light through the jailhouse's one small window was amber and dusty. "Do you still have the evidence?" she asked. "About the land fraud?" He looked at her with an expression that for the first time contained something that might have been actual hope, which was a fragile and therefore alarming thing to see on the face of a man scheduled to hang. "It's in a sealed envelope," he said, "in the lining of my saddlebag, in Tate's storage room." She stood up. "Drink the soup," she said, "all of it." She went to find Marshal Tate. The next 3 days were the most complicated of Etta Boone's life, and she had had some complicated ones. She navigated them with the same practical focus she brought to managing the boarding house, one thing at a time. What is the next necessary action? What is the resource I have? How do I apply the resource to the action? She got Tate to open Clement's saddlebag. She retrieved the envelope herself, under Tate's supervision, and she sat at his desk while Tate read the contents, which were a survey map with annotated boundary markers, 3 pages of Clement's own careful handwriting describing what he had found and when, and 2 original letters from Roland Driscoll to a railroad official that had been obtained by means Clement had not explained and Etta had not asked about. Tate read it all twice. Then he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a very long time. "This is significant," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "This changes things considerably." "Yes," she said again. "I need to contact the territorial governor's office." "Yes," she said a third time, and she did not try to contain the small surge of something fierce and victorious that moved through her, because she had earned it. But things did not resolve cleanly, because they never did. Because this was the New Mexico Territory in 1882, and Roland Driscoll was a man with money and connections, and the kind of patience that wealthy men with dark purposes always seem to have. Frank Price had not left Harlow Creek. He had been watching, and when he saw Etta coming and going from the jailhouse repeatedly, and when he heard through whatever network such men maintained that Tate had sent telegrams north to the governor's office, he understood that the situation had changed in a way that threatened his employer's interests. Price did not go to the jailhouse. He went to the Blue Shutter boarding house on a Thursday evening, and he sat down across from Etta in her parlor, and he put $500 on the table between them in cash, and he said, "Stop what you are doing and this is yours." Etta looked at the money. She looked at Price. She thought about the boarding house, the mortgage she was still paying, the roof that needed new shingles, the fact that $500 was more than she made in a good year. "No," she said. Price looked at her with those flat, pale eyes. "There's a different version of this conversation," he said. where the word I use instead of offer is warning." Etta's hands resting on her lap went very still. She understood what he was saying. She understood the territory she was in, the genuine danger of it, a danger that was not abstract but was sitting across from her in the form of a man who had made violence a profession. "I appreciate your clarity," she said, "and I will tell you clearly in return that if anything happens to me, Marshal Tate already has a letter explaining who I suspect would be responsible. I wrote it yesterday." This was a lie. She had written it that morning after 3 days of watching Frank Price watch her from across the street. "Good evening, Mr. Price." He left. She did not sleep that night, but she did not write the letter she claimed to have already written, which would have been wasted effort anyway, because by the time morning came, the situation had shifted again. The response from the governor's office arrived by Friday morning, and it was not the response she had hoped for in its form, but it contained within it the seed of what eventually became the outcome she needed. The message acknowledged receipt of the documents Tate had forwarded and indicated that a special investigator from the United States Attorney's Office would be dispatched to Harlow Creek within 2 weeks. 2 weeks was a long time. The circuit judge was arriving today. The hearing was today. Etta was at the jailhouse at 7 in the morning, and she brought soup because it was the only concrete thing she could do, and because doing something concrete was how she managed terror. Clement took the soup and looked at her over the bowl with those gray eyes and said, "How does it look?" "The governor's office is sending an investigator," she said, "but not for 2 weeks." He absorbed this. "The hearing is this afternoon." "I know. Tate will present what I gave him. It may be enough to delay the proceedings." "It may," she agreed. There was a silence. Outside, the sounds of a Friday morning in Harlow Creek, horses, the freight wagon, someone hammering something somewhere down the street. "Etta," he said, and the way he said her name was different from the earlier times, quieter and more deliberate, as if he had been thinking about how to use it and had decided that now was the time. "Whatever happens today, I want you to know that what you did," he stopped, and she could see him searching for a way to say it that was adequate, which was a search she understood because she had been conducting a version of it herself for the better part of a week. "Nobody has gone to that kind of trouble for me since I was a boy," he said finally. "Not for any reason." She looked at him. The cell bars were between them, and the distance was not far, less than 2 feet, and the morning light was on his face, and his fever was mostly gone, and he looked, for the first time since she had known him, like someone who was allowing himself to be seen without the protective layer of calculation and survival mode cleverness. "I know what it feels like," she said, which were the same words she had said to him on that very first evening, the truest words she had. He reached through the bars. His hand was large, as she had noticed when she first saw him lying on the cot, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she put her hand in his and they held on, not dramatically, just steadily, the way 2 people hold on to something when they are not sure what is coming next, but they are sure they would rather face it together. "Whatever happens today," he said again. "Whatever happens," she agreed. The hearing that afternoon was not a hanging, though it was not an acquittal either. Circuit Judge Hollis Crane was a meticulous man of 60 who had been riding the circuit for 20 years and had seen more manipulated evidence and corrupted proceedings than he cared to count, which meant that when Marshal Tate presented Clement Winslow's documents and his own telegram correspondence with Dona County and the governor's office response, Judge Crane did not dismiss it. He sat with it for 2 hours and then announced that he was remanding the defendant to the custody of the Harlow Creek sheriff, pending the arrival of the United States Attorney's investigator, that no sentencing would occur until the investigative findings were reviewed, and that any attempt to interfere with the defendant's custody or with the ongoing investigation would be treated as obstruction. He looked directly at Frank Price when he said the last part. Price met his gaze with those flat eyes and then looked away. Clement was not free. He was still in the cell, but he was alive, and the immediate threat of the gallows had retreated, and that was enough for right now. Etta walked back to the blue shutter boarding house in the slanted October light, feeling emptied out in the specific way of someone who has been running on adrenaline for days and has just been given permission to stop briefly. She sat in the kitchen and had a cup of coffee and watched the shadows on the wall and let herself feel the full weight of the past week for a few minutes before setting it aside and starting supper. The 2 weeks that followed were strange and suspended, a time out of normal time, like the held breath between lightning and thunder. Clement remained in the jailhouse and Etta visited every day. She always brought something, not always soup, sometimes cornbread, sometimes a book from her small collection, because she had learned in those nighttime conversations during his fever that he was a reader. She brought him a worn copy of Mr. Dickens's Great Expectations, which he had apparently read twice before and had things to say about, strong things, which led to a conversation through the bars that lasted 2 hours and ranged from literature to the nature of hope to whether a man could remake himself after the events that had defined him. And that conversation, she would say later, was the one where she knew with certainty what she felt and stopped pretending otherwise. Sheriff Morrow, who was a man of considerable personal integrity, arranged for a chair to be placed outside the cell so that Etta could sit during her visits instead of crouching on the floor. This was a small kindness and also a statement, the statement being that the sheriff had formed his own opinion about the situation and was quietly acting on it in the ways available to him. Frank Price left Harlow Creek on the 4th day after the hearing. He left without any overt statement or farewell, which was in some ways more unsettling than a departure accompanied by threats, because it meant the threat had not concluded but only changed venue. Mr. Aldous Pitts moved out of the boarding house during this period, heading south to Las Cruces for geological reasons that he explained at considerable length to anyone who would hold still. Cal Finney remained, and he was more useful than Etta had previously appreciated, because his position at the telegraph office meant he received information early and shared it freely with people he considered friends. And he had, at some point in the previous weeks, apparently decided that Etta was among those people. It was Cal who brought her the news on a Thursday afternoon, 11 days after the hearing, that the United States Attorney's investigator had arrived in Harlow Creek on the afternoon stage. The investigator was a man named George Pemberton, 35 years old, Yale-educated, with the manner of someone who had been sent to the territories by people in Washington who wanted results quickly and quietly. He was competent and thorough, and had no allegiance to Roland Driscoll or Cochise County politics, which was the most important thing about him. He interviewed Clement for 4 hours on his first day. He interviewed Etta on the second day, about what she had found in the saddlebag and the circumstances under which she had acquired it, and he asked careful questions that she answered carefully, and at the end of it he looked at her over his spectacles and said, "Miss Boone, your involvement in this matter has been unusual." "Yes," she agreed. "The defendant is fortunate," he said. She said nothing to that, because there was nothing to say that was not more revealing than she wanted to be with a federal investigator. By the end of his second week in Harlow Creek, Pemberton had sent 3 lengthy reports back to the attorney's office and had dispatched a separate communication to the U.S. Marshal's office regarding Roland Driscoll, Wade Calder, and the fraudulent land grant claims. He had done this efficiently and without fanfare, and when he was finished, he came to the jailhouse in the late afternoon and spoke to Judge Crane, who had remained in Harlow Creek at Tate's request, and what followed was a proceeding of less than an hour in the courthouse that cleared Clement Winslow of the Dona on county murders on the grounds of false attribution and insufficient evidence. And that referred the Cochise County self-defense killings to a separate review that Pemberton indicated would very likely result in no charges given the evidentiary picture. The Santa Fe Railroad robbery was another matter. Clement had been there. He had acknowledged it from the beginning. The charge was not dismissed but was referred for a separate hearing with a negotiated outcome that Pemberton indicated privately. In the corridor outside the courthouse, he expected to result in a fine and restitution rather than incarceration, given Clement's cooperation with the Driscoll investigation and the mitigating circumstances of the land fraud. He was not free, not entirely, not yet. But he walked out of the jailhouse that evening under his own power with no chains on him, and Marshal Tate returned his horse and his saddle and the saddlebag, and he stood in the street in the early November dark and took a breath of cold air that was the specific kind of breath a person takes when they have not breathed freely in a very long time. Etta was waiting on the sidewalk in front of the jailhouse. She had not been sure she should be there, had had a long internal debate about it on the walk over, but she was there. He saw her. He walked over. He stopped a foot from her, which was close enough. "They gave back my horse," he said. "I heard," she said. "I have to stay in the county through the hearing next month," he said. "I can't leave." "I know," she said. "I was wondering," he said, and there was something in his voice that she had not heard before, not even in those long conversations through the bars, a careful uncertainty that felt very much like courage, whether there might be a room available at the Blue Shutter boarding house, temporarily. She looked at him. He was thinner than he had been on the first night, still slightly hollow from the fever, the chest cold now cleared, his dark hair needing cutting, his coat showing the wear of the past weeks. He looked like a man who had come through something. She had brought him soup when he was sick. She had gone to bat for him when she barely knew him. She had sat up through fever nights and navigated marshals and federal investigators and the cold-eyed threats of Roland Driscoll's hired man. She had read Dickens with him through iron bars. She thought, she was fairly certain, that she was in love with him. Temporarily, she said, which was a word she had decided to use, temporarily. The November hearing on the railroad robbery was, as Pemberton had indicated, largely procedural. The Santa Fe Railroad's attorneys, presented with the full picture of Roland Driscoll's land fraud and the ways in which Clement Winslow's involvement in the robbery had been entangled with that larger criminal conspiracy, agreed to a settlement that involved restitution of his portion of the stolen funds, which he paid with a note against future wages and a period of probation. It was not nothing. It was also not a death sentence or a prison term, and in the context of the previous months, it felt like a different kind of grace. He moved into the room at the end of the hall on a permanent basis after the November hearing, which was how it was described, permanent, though that word had not been used by either of them, and was simply understood from the way he unpacked the few things he had, and arranged them in the room with the deliberate care of someone who does not intend to pack them again. He began helping around the boarding house almost immediately, not because she asked him to, but because he was that kind of man, the kind who could not stand idle while work was visible. He repaired the porch railing that had been loose since the previous spring. He rehung the gate that had been sagging on its hinges. He helped haul water and wood without being asked, and he was in the kitchen in the mornings in a way that initially surprised her, and then became so much a part of the morning that its absence would have left a gap. He was, she discovered, a good cook, better than she expected from a man who had been living rough for 2 years. He had learned from his mother, he told her one morning, standing at her kitchen stove with a skillet of potatoes, a woman who had cooked for a ranch crew of 12, and believed that the quality of a person's character was directly related to the care they took with food. "That's something my mother would have said," Etta told him. "What was she like?" she told him. And he told her about his mother, and about the ranch in Colorado Territory where he had grown up, and about the father who had died when he was 15 and the older brother who had taken over the ranch, and eventually lost it to drought and poor decisions, and about the years of working survey crews and mining camps, and how he had come to work for the Santa Fe Railroad, and find himself in the wrong place with the wrong knowledge at the wrong time. They talked like this in the kitchen in the mornings, quietly, while the boarding house woke up around them, and in the evenings on the porch when the last of the day's light went long and amber across the high desert, and sometimes in the parlor where she kept her books and he would read and she would sew, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not need to be filled. Cal Finney observed all of this with the cheerful interest of a young man who finds the romantic entanglements of older people both mysterious and entertaining. He said nothing directly but had a habit of departing the kitchen or the parlor with convenient suddenness whenever the two of them were in the same room, which Etta found both transparent and rather endearing. It was on a Tuesday evening in late November, with the first real cold of the season settling over Harlow Creek and a fire going in the parlor, that Clement looked up from his book and said, "Etta." She looked up from her sewing. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Something I've been figuring out how to say." She put the sewing down. She gave him her whole attention. "I've been running for 2 years," he said, "and before that I was moving, always moving, survey crews and mining camps, and I told myself it was ambition, but it was really just the inability to be still anywhere because being still meant feeling things I didn't want to feel." He stopped. "You are the first place I have been still in longer than I can remember. Not the town, not the boarding house." He met her eyes. "You." Etta looked at him. This man who had appeared at her back, gate half drowned and bleeding, and had somehow, without any of the expected ceremonies of courtship, made himself necessary to the daily architecture of her life. "I haven't been still in a long time either," she said quietly. "Not the way you mean." He set his book aside and she set her sewing aside, and they were on opposite sides of the parlor, but neither of them was uncertain about the distance or how to close it. And when he crossed the room and took her hand, it was with the same steadiness she had felt through the jail cell bars in October, the same quality of someone who has made a decision and is committed to it. "I'd like to stay," he said, "if you'd have me." "Not in the room here with you." She could have said something clever. She could have said something careful. She said instead, "Yes, I would have you. I would very much have you." He kissed her then. It was not a tentative kiss or a cautious one. It was the kiss of two people who have been through something difficult together and have come out the other side and know each other in the way that difficulty makes you know people, not the easy surface of them but the actual bones. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of kiss that means something and knows it. Cal Finney, in his room upstairs, was heard to say to nobody in particular, "Finally," with the satisfaction of a man whose prediction has been confirmed, and then to knock something off his nightstand in the startlement of having said it out loud. December arrived with the particular crispness of the high desert winter, and with it came the last administrative resolution of Clement's legal situation. The Cochise County Review concluded as Pemberton had predicted, with no charges filed on the self-defense grounds, and the note against future wages for the Santa Fe Railroad restitution was formalized and signed. He was, by December 10th, a free man in the full sense of the word. He stood in the kitchen of the Blue Shutter boarding house the morning after the final documentation was completed, and Etta was making biscuits, and he was making coffee, and the ordinary quality of it, the dailiness of it, was the thing that finally made the reality land in him. "I'm free," he said, mostly to himself. Etta looked at him over her shoulder, flour on her hands, a slight smile that she did not try to contain. "Yes," she said, "you are." "I should," he started and then stopped. "Should what?" "I was going to say I should think about what I want to do next, where I want to go, what kind of work I want to find." He paused. "But I know already." She turned from the biscuits fully. "Tell me," she said. "I want to be here," he said. "Here, in this kitchen, in this house, in this town, with you. I want to figure out how to stay, properly stay, not as a boarder or as someone passing through, but as a man who has a life and a place and a person in that life who he intends to keep." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking you to marry me, Etta. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying it plainly because I think you're a woman who prefers plain." She did prefer plain. She had always preferred plain. "Yes," she said, and turned back to the biscuits because they would burn if she didn't. and because she was smiling too widely to manage the conversation and the biscuits simultaneously. He came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders and pressed his forehead briefly to the back of her head, and she felt the warmth of him, the specific warmth of a person who has made himself safe to you. And she thought that this was the furthest thing from the boarding house loneliness she had spent 3 years navigating, and she was grateful, deeply and fully grateful, in a way that felt as much like wonder as anything else. They married in January 1883, on a clear cold Saturday at the Harlow Creek Methodist Church, which was a small building that nonetheless held the entire town because the entire town came, including Sheriff Morrow, who shook Clement's hand with enough feeling to suggest that he had been privately rooting for the outcome, and including Cal Finney, who wept in the specific way of young men who are moved by things they would never admit to being moved by. Mr. Aldous Pitts had returned from Las Cruces for unrelated geological reasons, and happened to be in town, and attended out of what he described as scientific curiosity about the institution of marriage, which everyone understood to be affection, rendered in the dialect of a man who did not believe in sentimentality. The Reverend, a gentle man named Aldridge who had been in Harlow Creek longer than anyone else, said the words, and Clement and Etta said theirs, and when it was done and they walked out of the church into the sharp January light, there was a quality to the moment that Etta would try to describe to herself later and could only arrive at this. It felt like arriving. Not at the church, not at the marriage, but at the life, the one that had been waiting. They had a small celebration at the boarding house that evening, with Etta's cooking and a fiddle player from the saloon who was persuaded to play politely for 2 hours in exchange for supper, and people sat in the parlor and the kitchen and on the porch, which was cold but not unbearably so, and it was the kind of evening that towns like Harlow Creek were built for. A gathering that was also a statement that this is what we are, that these people are ours. When everyone had gone and the house was quiet, Etta and Clement sat together on the porch in the cold, her shoulder against his, looking at the town's few lights and the enormous dark sky above the desert that was so thick with stars it seemed almost audible. "Roland Driscoll," she said, because the name had come into her mind, and she had been thinking about it on and off since the legal proceedings ended. "What happens to him?" Clement was quiet for a moment. "Pemberton's investigation is ongoing," he said. "The land fraud case is federal. It could take years." He paused. "I don't know if he faces what he deserves. Men like Driscoll often don't. Does that eat at you?" He thought about it genuinely, which she appreciated. "It did," he said. "It was eating at me from the inside for 2 years, the injustice of it, the fact that his people made me a murderer on paper and I couldn't do anything about it. But somewhere in the last few months it stopped eating and became something else." "What did it become?" "Something I'm not carrying anymore," he said, "because I have something to carry instead, something better." She took his hand. The stars above the New Mexico territory were brilliant and indifferent and old, and they sat under them together, and that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Spring came to Harlow Creek in March with the tentative beauty of desert springs, the ocotillo putting out its red flowers, the sage going silver-green, the light shifting from the flat cold white of winter to something warmer and more complex. Clement had, over the course of the winter months, taken up work with the local surveying outfit, a company run by a man named Henry Bosworth, who had been looking for an experienced surveyor since his last one had departed for California. Clement's credentials were unimpeachable, his knowledge of the region's geography extensive, and Bosworth hired him without hesitation. It was honest work. Clement left the boarding house in the mornings with his equipment and his horse, the same horse that had carried him 4 miles through the rain to the garden gate in October, and he came back in the evenings and helped Etta in the kitchen and sat with her in the evenings, and the rhythm of it was the best thing, the most deeply satisfying thing, that Etta had known. She found out she was expecting their first child in April. She told him in the kitchen on an early April morning, no ceremony, just directly, because she was a woman who preferred plain, and the look on his face was one she had never seen there before, an unguarded, almost helpless joy that transformed him in a way that made her love him more, which she had not thought she could. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her, careful and close, and said something into her hair that she couldn't quite make out but understood from its tone. "A boy," Cal Finney said authoritatively at breakfast that morning, having been informed by virtue of the fact that he lived in the boarding house and was impossible to keep secrets from. "I have a feeling." "Your feelings are generally about baseball," Etta told him. "Baseball and people," Cal said, undefended. He was right as it happened. Their son was born on a Monday morning in late December 1883, a fine cold day with the first serious snow of the season coming down outside the bedroom window, and Dr. Marsh, the town's physician, pronounced him healthy and substantial, and they named him Thomas after Clement's father and called him Tom almost immediately. Etta lay in the bed with Tom against her chest and Clement beside her on the bed with his arm around her shoulders, looking at their son with that same helpless, unguarded expression he had worn in April. And she thought of all the things that had led to this moment. The dark rainy night and the garden gate and the boarding house and the fever and the soup and the cell bars and the hearing and the books and the evenings on the porch and the January wedding and everything in between. She thought of the woman who had been lonely in this house 3 years ago, running a business that was hers and proud of it and still, underneath, profoundly alone. She thought of the man who had been running for 2 years, carrying a dark past and a false name on a poster, unable to be still. She thought of the soup of all things, the most ordinary act, the one that had started everything. Tom Winslow made a small sound in his sleep and his tiny fist opened and closed against Etta's nightgown and she pressed her lips to the top of his head. "You should sleep," Clement said softly. "In a minute," she said. "I want to stay here a minute." He tightened his arm around her shoulders and she stayed, and he stayed, and the snow came down outside, quiet and steady, covering Harlow Creek in white. Wade Calder was brought to justice in the summer of 1884. The United States Attorney's investigation into Roland Driscoll had taken the better part of a year, but it had been thorough, and when it concluded it resulted in federal charges against Driscoll for land grant fraud, against Calder for the Dona County murders, and against several associated parties for various related crimes. The trials were conducted in Santa Fe with federal judges who had no connections to the Cochise County machine, and the verdicts were appropriately delivered: Driscoll to a federal penitentiary for 8 years, Calder for the murders on 2 counts, the justice machine slow but real. George Pemberton sent Clement a letter when the verdicts were announced. It was brief and professional and contained, at the very end, a single sentence that said, "The outcome would not have been possible without the original preservation of the survey evidence and the courage of the person who brought it to the attention of the proper authorities." He did not name Etta, but Clement read that sentence aloud to her in the kitchen and then read it again, and they looked at each other over the kitchen table with Tom playing on the floor between them with a wooden spoon he had adopted as his preferred toy. "That's about you," Clement said. "It's about both of us," she said. "The bigger part is about you." She shook her head, but she did not argue further because she understood what he was saying. She understood that the life they had built together had its roots in a moment of choice, her choice, made in a kitchen on a rainy night with no certainty about any of it, only a conviction that a man who needed help was a man who deserved to receive it, regardless of what the posters said. Cal Finney got married in 1885 to a schoolteacher named Ruth who had arrived in Harlow Creek the previous year, and Etta and Clement hosted the wedding reception at the boarding house, which felt entirely appropriate given that Cal had lived there through all the dramatic events of the previous years, and considered himself, not entirely without justification, a participant in the Winslow family story. Ruth Finney was exactly the right person for Cal, which was to say she was patient about the baseball and could outthink him in every conversation without him quite realizing it, and they were happy in the way of two people who are very well matched and know it. By 1886, the Blue Shutter boarding house had been expanded, Clement having added a wing on the north side with 2 additional rooms and a proper sitting room for the boarders, a project he had designed and largely built himself over the course of a summer with help from 2 other men from the town who were handy with lumber and happy to work for Etta's cooking. The boarding house was, by this point, the best regarded in the region, which Etta accepted with the matter-of-fact pride of a woman who has worked very hard for a thing and sees no reason to pretend she hasn't. Their second child arrived in February 1887, a daughter they named Clara, after Clara Hensley, the widow in Bisbee whose information had been the first real crack in the case against Clement, and who had written Etta a long letter of congratulation when she heard of their marriage, a letter Etta kept in the tin box under the bed where she kept important things. Clara was from the first day different from Tom in every way, quieter and more observant, and given to looking at things with a focused attention that made people feel, even when she was very small, that she was taking notes. Tom was already 3 years old and had opinions about everything, and conducted himself like a small person who found the world deeply interesting and himself equal to it, which Etta suspected would either serve him very well or present problems, probably both. Clement, with both children, was the kind of father Etta had hoped he would be and then found she had underhoped for, because the reality exceeded the expectation. He was present and attentive and took them seriously in the way that good parents do, treating their questions and concerns as real rather than trivial, and he was also capable of the kind of play that required adults to set aside dignity entirely, which he did with evident and complete willingness. He told her once in the evening after the children were asleep that he had not expected to be good at it. "Fatherhood," he said. "I had no real model for it. My father died when I was 15, and before that he was a hard man, not cruel, just hard." And she said, "And they make it easy," he said, which was not entirely true, as anyone who has raised small children knows, but she understood what he meant by it, that Tom and Clara made the love part of it easy, which was the part he had been uncertain about. She loved him for saying it, and for all the things like it that he said, the honest, slightly effortful honesty of a man who had spent years not being able to afford feelings and was learning, in the safety of this life they had built, that he could afford them now. 1987 turned to 88 with the usual events of a small town's life, births and deaths, and the drama of the dry goods store changing hands, and the question of whether the new railroad spur would come through Harlow Creek or bypass it to the north. And the Winslow household moved through all of it with the specific quality that long-established happiness has. Not the dazzling excitement of the new, but the deep, reliable warmth of something that has been tested and has held. Clement's surveying work had expanded along with the railroad surveying contracts, and he was well enough regarded in the profession that he had been offered a partnership with Henry Bosworth, which he accepted, and the business, Bosworth and Winslow Surveying, became one of the more successful small enterprises in the region over the following years, trusted by the railroad companies, trusted by the land developers, trusted by the territorial authorities who were in the long, slow process of sorting out the land grant disputes that Roland Driscoll's fraud had created. He was not rich. They were not rich. But they were comfortable, which was a word that does not fully convey what it meant to people who had each, in their own way, known the other version, the version where comfort was uncertain, and the next disaster was always a season away. Comfortable for them meant solvent and warm and fed and free of the particular grinding anxiety of financial precarity, and it was everything. Tom started school in the fall of 1888 and immediately identified reading as his favorite activity and mathematics as his second favorite, which Etta attributed to Clement's influence and Clement attributed to Etta's, and both of them were probably right. In the spring of 1889, Etta found out she was expecting again. She told Clement in the kitchen in the morning, as she had told him the first time, directly and plainly, and he looked at her with the same unguarded joy he had worn the first time, which she had thought might be diluted by repetition and found was not. Their second son, James, was born in November 1889, and named for no particular historical or familial reason, but simply because when they laid him in Etta's arms and looked at him, they agreed that he looked like a James, which he did, with a kind of inherent dignity that seemed improbable in a newborn. The family of 5 settled into the years of the early 1890s, with the full, busy, ordinary richness of a life being lived rather than survived. Tom grew tall and opinionated and deeply interested in mathematics and the law, and Clement said privately to Etta one evening that their son might be a lawyer, and Etta said she hoped he would be because the territories needed more good ones, and they sat with that satisfaction quietly for a moment. Clara, at 7, was already the most determined person in the household, which was saying something given the competition. She had decided she was interested in medicine, specifically in how the body worked, which had led to some startling requests for information from Dr. Marsh, and some conversations with Etta that were not what she had anticipated having with a 7-year-old. James was small and cheerful and deeply attached to the cat that had taken up residence in the boarding house kitchen the previous winter, and that everyone in the family called Soup, for reasons that required a story to explain. The name of the cat came from Tom, who was 9 at the time and had asked his parents one evening how they had met, and Clement and Etta had looked at each other over the children's heads with the particular look of two people who share a story that they have told in its full form many times but that never quite loses its capacity to move them. And Clement had said, "Your mother brought me soup," and Tom had looked at the cat on the kitchen floor, who was at that moment investigating a bowl of something, and said, "We should call the cat Soup," and James, at a year old, had made a sound that the assembled family agreed to interpret as enthusiastic endorsement. And so the cat was Soup, and the story behind the name was the story of how the most wanted man in 2 territories had been brought down not by a bounty hunter or a marshal, but by a bowl of sage broth and the woman with steady hands who made it. Etta told it sometimes to new boarders, when they had been there long enough to ask about the blue shutters and the family and the general warmth of the place that seemed to live in the walls as well as the people. She told it straightforwardly, the way she did everything, the dark rainy night and the garden gate and the fever and the cell bars and the documents and the hearing and the marriage. And when she got to the soup part, the specific act of making soup for a sick man in a jail cell, because it was the right thing to do regardless of the posters and the reward and the fear, the boarders always looked at her with the expression of people hearing a story that confirms something they wanted to believe about the world. Clement, when he was present for these tellings, would add at the end, invariably, "She was also the only one who brought me soup." And Etta would say, "I was the only one who knew how to make it properly." And they would look at each other with the expression of two people who have been telling the same story for years and find it no less true for the telling. The New Mexico Territory became the state of New Mexico in 1912, and by that time the Winslow children were grown, Tom a lawyer in Santa Fe as Clement had predicted, Clara a trained nurse, and later a physician in Albuquerque in the years when that path was possible but still required a particular kind of determination, which Clara had always possessed in excess. James ran the surveying business, Bosworth and Winslow, which he had joined as a partner when Henry Bosworth retired, and which he ran with the same steady competence his father had brought to it. Harlow Creek itself had grown, not dramatically. It was never going to be Albuquerque or Santa Fe, but solidly, a community with a school and a proper hospital by 1900, and a rail connection by 1895, and the particular quality of towns that have been through things together and know who they are. The Blue Shutter boarding house was still standing in 1912, and was still the best-regarded establishment of its kind in the region, though it had changed over the years, expanded twice more, converted one wing into a small hotel with proper private baths, updated the kitchen with a modern range, and the shutters had been repainted their particular blue so many times that the blue had become almost a landmark, a thing people gave as directions. Turn left at the blue shutters. Etta and Clement were in their 50s by statehood, which in 1912 was not old, but was a different country from the young people they had been, and they navigated that country together with the same steadiness they had brought to everything else. He still had those gray eyes, sharper than ever with age, and she still had the practical, unsentimental directness that had made her push a bowl of soup through jail cell bars and then go to argue with a federal marshal. And together, they were still the specific and irreplaceable thing they had been from the beginning. Two people who saw each other clearly and chose each other anyway. They took a trip to Santa Fe in 1913 to visit Tom, who had a law practice there, and a wife named Helen and two children, Clement and Etta's first grandchildren. On the train going up, with the New Mexico desert spreading brilliant and enormous around them, Clement took Etta's hand in the way he had done for 30 years, the same quality of it, steady and deliberate, and she looked out the window at the country she had made her home and felt the full length of all those years not as weight but as foundation, everything that had happened and been survived and been chosen, all of it under her feet, solid and real. "What are you thinking?" Clement asked. She turned from the window and looked at him, this man who had come to her gate in the rain, this man whose name had been on a poster, this man she had made soup for, this man she had chosen and continued to choose in all the years and all the ways that choice presented itself. "That I would do it all the same," she said. "Every bit of it." He looked at her with those gray eyes that had, if anything, grown clearer and more present over the years, not dimmed, a thing she had sometimes worried about and found was not going to happen. "So would I," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and the train went north through the desert, and the country was vast and indifferent and magnificent around them, and they were, as they had been for 30 years, entirely each other's. Back in Harlow Creek, on the kitchen shelf of the Blue Shutter boarding house, there was a particular tin bowl, dented on one side from decades of use, that Etta had never replaced though she had been offered newer ones many times. It was the bowl she had used for the soup. The one she had pushed under the cell bars. The boarders sometimes asked about it and she told them, and they would look at the bowl with the expression of people encountering an artifact that is more significant than it appears. It was just a bowl. It was also everything. The cat called Soup had long since passed, as cats do, but there had been a succession of cats after her in the kitchen, all of them answering to the same name, so that Soup was both an individual and a tradition, which seemed appropriate. James, running the surveying business, married in 1915 and brought his wife, a forthright woman named Marjorie from Las Cruces, into the family with the confident ease of a man whose parents had modeled for him exactly what a marriage worth having looked like. Marjorie and Etta were, within 3 months of meeting, the kind of friends that women become when they recognize in each other a shared quality of directness and genuine interest. And the family holidays at the Blue Shutter boarding house in those years were full, boisterous, and exactly the kind of thing that neither Etta nor Clement had had as children and had made for themselves as adults. Clara, true to her nature, had gotten her medical education through a combination of nursing training and a connection with a progressive physician in Albuquerque who believed in her abilities before the formal pathways were fully open. And by 1920, she was practicing medicine in Albuquerque with a reputation for competence and an absolute refusal to be told what was possible for a woman in her profession. Clement said, with absolute sincerity, that Clara was the most formidable person he knew, which, coming from a man who had survived what he had survived, was the highest compliment available. Tom's legal career eventually brought him into the sphere of land rights and indigenous claims, work that was difficult and imperfect and important, and he brought to it the same conviction about justice being properly administered that his mother had brought to a jailhouse in October 1882. He had heard that story enough times to have absorbed its logic at the level of principle, that justice required being willing to act when it was inconvenient, and that the most important moments were the ones when it would have been easier not to. Etta and Clement grew into the later years of their life, with the contentment of people who have paid attention to the things that mattered and let the things that didn't recede. The boarding house ran, the family came for holidays, the grandchildren accumulated and grew into distinct and interesting people, and Harlow Creek went on being Harlow Creek, a small town in the high desert of New Mexico that had its particular history and its particular character, and the blue shutters that everyone used for directions. On a morning in September 1920, 38 years after a woman had pushed a bowl of soup through a jail cell bars and asked a sick man if he could drink all of it, Etta Boone Winslow stood in her kitchen making soup. It was not a dramatic occasion. It was a Tuesday. Clement had a slight cold, nothing serious, the kind of thing that required management rather than concern. She was making the sage broth with the bone marrow and the dried chili peppers she still grew in the garden, the same recipe, because it was the best recipe, and the best things did not need changing. He came into the kitchen, her husband of 37 years, still tall though the dark hair had gone gray, still with those creekwater eyes, still with the quality of presence she had noticed in the amber light of that first jailhouse afternoon, the quality of a man who had decided to be fully there. He saw the soup on the stove and looked at her with the expression she knew better than her own face. "Sage broth," he said. "You have a cold," she said. "I'm not that sick." "You were sicker the first time," she said, "and I made you soup then too." He came to stand beside her at the stove, and she handed him a wooden spoon to stir, which was how they had cooked together for decades, side by side, one or the other of them at the stove, passing implements and tasting and adjusting. Did it help, he asked, which was a question he asked sometimes about that first soup in the way of a man who likes to revisit the beginning of things. "You're still here," she said. "So yes, it helped." He stirred the soup and she cut the bread, and through the kitchen window the September light was golden and sharp over the high desert, and the blue shutters were on the windows, and the cat called Soup the Sixth was asleep in the corner, and outside somewhere James was doing something to the wagon that required periodic hammering, and inside the house was the accumulated weight and warmth of all those years, all those choices, all those ordinary mornings that had added up to a life. This is the life, Etta thought. This is it right here. Not in any single dramatic moment, but in all of it. The rainy night and the jail cell and the soup and the hearing and the wedding and the children and the grandchildren and the blue shutters and 38 years of standing at this stove with this man beside her, and every ordinary Tuesday that had ever been or would ever be. "Drink all of it," she said when the soup was ready. "All of it." Clement Winslow, once the most wanted man in 2 territories, looked at his wife with those gray eyes full of 38 years of her and smiled. "Yes," he said, "ma'am." And they sat down together, in the kitchen of the Blue Shutter boarding house, in Harlow Creek, New Mexico in the year 1920, and the soup was good, as it always had been, as it always would be. And outside the windows the desert light was golden, and the world was as wide as it had ever been, and they were, as they had always been, exactly where they were supposed to be.